Now, just as an additional example of this technique, I'm going to create another adjustment layer, another curves layer, and I'm going to zoom in on the image here and take a look at these foreground tones. I'm going to just pull my curve down until my tones are about as dark as I think I'll want them. Somewhere in that region. That looks about right. And I'm also going to increase the contrast in there. Okay. Now, if I zoom back out, you can see that as an overall image, that just looks really bad. It looks too contrasty. But what I'm going to do is go into my Layers palette, select my layer mask on this curves adjustment layer, and I'm going to press Control-I to invert that layer mask. And now it's all black. It's as though this curves layer is not even there. But what I can do now is get a paintbrush with some white paint, and I'm going to set my opacity. It's already down at about 30%. And now with this layer mask selected, I can paint on it and it will reveal the changes that I made in that curves adjustment layer. So let me zoom back in before I start making actual changes so you can see what I'm doing. If I just paint across the bottom here, then I'm basically painting in those curves. And if I want to accentuate it more, then I just paint over it a little bit more to make it closer to white. And this method, as you can see, pretty much allows me as much control as I want over my tones. That looks fine to me. That looks like about what I wanted to do with my image. The nice thing about this technique is that it's sort of like using the burn tool. The difference is you can never overdo it. The most you can do is get your layer mask to pure white so that your adjustment layer is showing through at 100%. So at most, you're only going to get as dark as you decided in advance. I think I'll actually go in with my adjustment layer here with my paintbrush and maybe add a little bit more contrast into the lower areas of these trees. Pretty subtle change, actually. Okay, and I think I'll leave it at that. Alright, I've zoomed out and I'm taking a look at the overall tones in the image, and they look okay to me. I don't think there's any major change I want to make at this point. The last thing that I could do if I wanted was I could add a gradient map, just because we saved preset the last time and I want to show that it is still here. There's the preset. I can click OK and apply this same tonal map as we used previously. And so if I were printing these two photos out and I wanted a little more, sort of cohesion between the two images, this would be one way to achieve that. Since we've taken a look at a couple of different landscape photos at this point, let's switch things up a little bit and take a look at a portrait. Something with a lot of skin tone in it. This This wedding photo should be a good example. I'm going to open this up in Camera Raw. And there we have it. So before we think about converting this to black and white, it's always helpful to take a look at all of the different colors that are present and get a better idea of their relationships. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit on this image. Let me tell you a little bit about this image actually. At first glance, this looks a little bit like a studio portrait, but in fact, I took this picture a couple of years ago of a bride as she was preparing for the ceremony in her dressing room. In the dressing room, we had a window on the wall to the camera left, and there was a bed down in front of the bride here, and she was arranging some clothing, and she looked up and smiled, and I got this nice shot of her. Now I'm pointing this out because if this had been a studio portrait, then we would expect the background to be a nice neutral gray. But if you take a look over here at the RGB values, when I mouse over the background, you see that the green value is actually significantly higher than the red and blue. So we have a green-toned background. In addition to that, of course, we have a lot of skin tones. The skin tones are going to be primarily yellows, oranges, and reds. And then we also have the interesting colors here in the tattoo. Some purples, some reds, some greens around the edges, and then around the margins of the tattoo, it's hard to tell exactly what color this is. Maybe some purples and blues in there as well. And her hair, incidentally, is brown with a little bit of red in it as well. Now let's head over to the HSL palette and convert to grayscale. I'm going to zoom this back out to all fit in view. And if you take a look at this, we have actually ended up with a really flat, boring picture. The skin tones are about the same tone as the background. The only thing that really stands out is a little bit of the highlight in her face, and down here on her dress, and of course her teeth a little bit. But all in all, it's not very contrasty, and not really a very pleasing black and white picture. So ideally what we'd like to do here is brighten up the skin tones and maybe darken the background a little bit so there's some contrast between our subject and the background. And then I'd like to see what we can do with the colors on the tattoo to make them stand out a little bit, since it was an important feature to her. And then we can make any changes in the overall contrast in the end. So since we know that her skin tones are going to be mostly reds, oranges, and yellows, let's begin by brightening up those tones and seeing how much contrast we get between the background. Bump up my oranges to about plus 18. Actually, that looks pretty nice. I'm also going to raise the reds and the yellows a little bit. And already that has made a nice difference. We see a little bit more contrast between her skin and the background, and if I want to darken that background, remember that it was a little bit green, so I can pull down my green slider and the aqua slider, and there we have a little bit of nice contrast. I'm actually going to brighten that back up a little bit. I'm also going to zoom in and see if I'm getting any noise from making that change in the background. And it looks okay. Anytime that you make large-scale changes over in the sliders here, you run the risk of bringing out unwanted details, especially when you've created contrast between two adjoining sliders like the reds and the oranges. Let me show you what I mean. Our bride here actually has nice, pretty, smooth skin. But just like everybody else, there's going to be a little bit of natural variation. And if we emphasize that variation by moving two of these sliders apart from each other. Like if I bring the reds way down, the effect is not very pleasant. As you can see, we get these sort of clownish looking lips and awful gums, and it brings out all of this sort of ugly ruddiness in her skin. She looks sort of diseased and reptilian in parts. So that is definitely not what we want to do with our subjects, at least not the ones that hire us. And of course, if we do something similar with the oranges, bring that way down, then we get a very different but still really bizarre effect. We can see all of this strange variation in the skin. In fact, we can emphasize this a little bit more by bringing up the reds, making those lips brighter. Anyway, this is obviously not what we want to do. We want to avoid making these sorts of drastic changes that bring out all of this extra detail that exists in everyone's skin, but we don't necessarily want to see it. So that's something to keep in mind when you're doing a conversion like this.